The Corvette Navy by James B. Lamb. Chapter 2. The Two Navies. Canada had two navies in the Second World War. First, of course, was the Royal Canadian Navy, the big navy, the real navy, the Pusser Navy. As it was, as its corps of public relations officers endlessly reiterated, a very big deal indeed. Thousands upon thousands of uniformed men and women filled teeming offices and training establishments, vast and ever-growing complexes of brick and concrete. Representing the investment of hundreds of millions of dollars, its organization embracing dozens of commands, hundreds of departments, and thousands of experts and specialists, ranging from physicists to dietitians, from jurists to journalists. It was a triumph of administrative genius that represents one of the nation's great wartime accomplishments. It is fashionable in peacetime to deride the capability of service bureaucrats, but not even General Motors or any other of the civilian corporate giants has ever managed in the time of peace anything to compare with the administrative miracle of the wartime RCN, which grew from 1,800 officers and men into a vast and complex machine of almost 100,000 men and women. Here was the repository of naval tradition, the showcase of talent and ability, the dynamic center of thrust and growth and expansion. Vast though it was by mid-war, it yet thrived and grew in every direction as busy men were driven to seek more assistance, more space in which to operate. Here was pay and pace and promotion. Here was where it was all at. Each morning at parade grounds across the country, on prairie and seacoast, scores of white ensigns ascended proudly into the clear Canadian air. Bands played and gunners' mates shouted, and thousands of feet marched in unison. Dozens of gym floors and paved parking lots earned a respectful salute, traditionally accorded the courting deck, the abode of authority. In Ottawa and Halifax, indeed in every city throughout the land, hundreds of uniformed Navy officers dumped their briefcases in hundreds of office cubicles, eased themselves behind their desk, and opened their morning newspapers to begin yet another day. A vast fleet of hundreds of vessels of every sort was attached to this great navy. Literally hundreds of coastal motor launches, harbor craft, and training vessels, armed yachts and gateships, harbor minesweepers and picket boats, all the endless number and variety of the 9 to 5 fleet. But the real strength of the big navy lay ashore. Its admirals threw their flags from office buildings, and its officers and men, ratings and wrens, had their wardrobes and mess decks in shore establishments. Land-bound battleships these, bearing old and famous naval names. It was a tremendous force, embodying some of the best brains in the country and involving a significant proportion of the nation's wealth and manpower. Although manned by reservists in their thousands, it was directed by professional Navy officers, and its operations were orientated to a hierarchy that included every senior officer the country possessed or could borrow from abroad. What it all accomplishment would be difficult to define, but of necessity it was preoccupied with recruiting, training, housing, feeding, administrating, and caring for itself. A great and endless task. Canada's Second Navy was a much different force. A bunch of amateur sailors, recruited from every walk of civilian life, managing ships deemed too small for command by professional Navy officers. The ships, Algerines, Corvettes, frigates, Bangors, were as cheap as they could be built, and their officers and men were involved not with admirals and captains, but with characters like Two-Gun Ryan, Harry the Horse, Death Ray, Foghorn Davis, and the Mad Spaniard. It was an amateur, improvised, cut-rate navy, but its purpose and accomplishment was clear. It fought and won the Battle of the Atlantic. This was the Corvette Navy, the Little Navy, Canada's other navy, manned by amateurs like me. The division between the two navies was surprisingly complete and clear-cut. Few regular Canadian Navy officers ever kept watch aboard a Corvette, and only a handful of Corvette crewmen were RCN ratings. For shortly after the outbreak of war, a strange process began. The little handful of professional naval officers, all that the country possessed, and the only Canadians trained over long peacetime years to fight a war at sea, were bustled ashore into offices. There they presided over clerks and typists in a series of administrative posts, for which they had received no training at all. Most of them never went to sea again. Their places afloat were taken by a handful of former merchant seamen, now officers in the Royal Canadian Reserve, and by young men in the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve, many of whom were called from offices ashore, and most of whom had never been to sea before. It was a situation worthy of Gulliver and Sullivan. Trained seamen were put in officers ashore, and trained officers and managers were sent to sea. As a result, Canada's professional naval officers were to play an ever-diminishing role in the Battle of the Atlantic. This curious situation had been brought about by a miscalculation in the role of the corvette, which would play in the naval war. Originally, Dame had thought of it as a stopgap, and as such, unworthy as commands for Canada's few precious trained naval officers. Aside from those allowed afloat in the RCN's handful of pre-war destroyers, permanent force officers were hoarded ashore against the time when new superships would appear to fight the glorious Armageddon against Germany's powerful surface fleet. Meanwhile, the little jury-built corvettes were filled up with reservists and packed off to do what they could in the squalid brawls with the U-boats around the herds of merchantmen. While waiting ashore, RCN officers accumulated experience in positions of responsibility and promotions that went with them. A few years ashore could do more for a fellow than a long lifetime afloat. But a funny thing happened to the regular Navy while it was waiting for the big ships that were to fight the big battle. For as the years went on, it became clear that the little battle, the U-boat thing, was in fact the big battle after all, and the little ships that were fighting it were all that were going to matter. The RCN pursued its original big ship notions to the very end. After weary years of construction that earned the names Moses and Methuselah, the two tribal-class destroyers that had been building in the Halifax shipyards since before the living memory were finally commissioned, and in the closing years of the war joined their British-built sisters in operation with the British Home Fleet. And as the German war ended, the RCN took over two British cruisers. Canada's tribals covered themselves with glory, particularly in the Channel shoot-ups along the invasion coast. But for all that, their operations, however exciting, were a sideshow. The main event was fought out, month after exhausting month in the North Atlantic. For the issue was simply command of the sea. Whoever held it held the initiative and could fight where, when, and how he chose. The Germans picked the U-boat as their weapon in the duel for the ocean supremacy, and consequently, it was the anti-submarine forces of the Allies, not their battle fleets, that were principally involved. Thus, it was little work-worn corvettes, frigates, and overage destroyers of the escort groups that contributed the most to the Allied victory, rather than their more glamorous and heavily gunned RCN sisters. From the very beginning, the men of the little navy were left largely on their own. Bewildered, RC and our lieutenant, only a month or two away from his second mate's berth in some merchant ship. His two interwoven curly stripes of gold lace still bright on each cuff, was dumped off at a shipbuilding yard to take over his new corvette command, with 3 or 4 officers as green to the Navy as himself, and 60 or 70 young men fresh from the prairies or city pavements who had never seen the sea before. If the new captain was lucky, one of his officers might have some practical experience of pilotage or navigations, if not too seasick to care. If his chief engineer had worked on a locomotive roundhouse and knew a little about steam engines, the captain found himself to be fortunate indeed. In the ensuing purgatory, the corvette captain learned to depend chiefly on his own resources, with help and advice from his fellow corvette commanders, or, if he was lucky enough to have a good one, from his group senior officer, who, in the early days of the war, was usually a professional naval officer commanding a destroyer, either RN or RCN. Certainly got no help from the shore establishment, not even from those officers who were supposedly responsible for the administration of his ship. I myself was commissioned into one of the early corvettes. In all the subsequent years at sea, we were never visited by any of the Canadian captain destroyers, or Captain D's they were called, whose direct responsibility we were, or for that matter, by any officer above the rank of commander. Yes, there was that one occasion. During the preparations for the invasion of Europe, a flotilla of Canadian fleet minesweepers lay off Spithead, working up for the assault on Normandy, where they were to precede the landing craft carrying the first wave of troops. It was an exciting place and an exciting time. The Channel ports were jammed with shipping, and Britain was crammed with troops, all trained and keyed up to the highest pitch for what everyone knew was going to be the turning point of the whole war. There was a sense of occasion aboard. All of us were the preparations for the greatest combined operation ever attempted by man, and here, at first hand, were the great leaders of the free world. From our vantage point along a dock wall, we had seen our king, George VI, and felt our heart surge as a slim finger in naval uniform drove past us. From the beginning, we had fought for George. Here he was, in his person, and we stare with awkward relevance at the earnest, dedicated man whose faith and purpose had so inspired us in far off Canada. Churchill came next, with his jaunty wave and jutting cigar. In the days that followed, we saw a succession of the great commanders to lead us. These were the hawk-faced Admiral Vaughan of the Royal Navy, the unsmiling Admiral Kirk of the United States Navy, and the familiar Monty in his black beret with oldie badges, leaning out of the open car as he toured the cheering troops. From the ships, we caught only a glimpse of Eisenhower, but like everyone else, we were fiercely proud to be led by the Ike, who, more than any other leader, woke instant affection, loyalty, and respect in the servicemen of every country. But in this parade of Allied personalities, Canada felt itself to be missing the boat. Her servicemen abroad were being seduced by the glamour of foreign, if Allied, powers. The word went out in London, and we received at last our first and only visit by a representative of the Royal Canadian Navy, Vice Admiral Percy Nels, a nice little man who looked a bit like a radio comedian Ed Wynn, and who had spent the greater part of his wartime career in Ottawa, came down from London to visit us. We followed him dutifully as he trotted about our emasculated decks and inspected our paraded crew, and saw him pipe over the back side to his waiting car. A short, plump little man with very thick glasses. He was not exactly a warrior leader calculated to fire our blood on the eve of this great assault, but he represented a Canadian presence in the big brass department. Ottawa had countered Washington and London admiral for admiral. In the answer of big guns, Vice Admiral Percy Nels rated as Canada's answer. The occasion however, was unique. In all the long years of war, no other Canadian senior officer ever trod the decks of any ships of the Canadian Corvette Navy that I served in, and even the commander was a rare event indeed. Corvette crews were young. Officers and men were mostly right out of high school, and anyone over 30 found himself nicknamed Pappy and the oldest man on the ship. Coincidentally, Corvette people were all junior in rank and rate, most of the upper deck crews being ordinary seamen, and with leading seamen often carrying out the jobs normally assigned to petty officers. And the engine room was filled with youngsters right out of mechanical training school. Early in the war, Corvette would be commanded by a Naval Reserve, ex-merchant Navy lieutenant, with a volunteer reserve lieutenant as an executive officer or Jim B1, and two other officers, junior lieutenants or sub-lieutenants, as watchkeepers. The corvettes were coupled together, half a dozen at a time, into escort groups, led by an old destroyer, usually commanded by a lieutenant or lieutenant commander of either the RCN or, especially in the early days, the RN. When you first joined a ship in the Canadian Navy, you passed from one world to another. You left behind the big Navy, where you had done your training. The shoreside Navy was all its braid and bands and bumps, and you joined an outfit that was run along the lines of a small corner store. For the Corvette types were family, and you soon got to know the characters in your own ship, and the others in the group. They were chummy ships, whose destinies always seemed to be bound up with yours. They were rivals, usually commanded by officers senior to your own. Months would go by, grow into years, and the shoreside Navy became a memory. Though there were always officers and men joining the ship for a trip or two before going back ashore to the other world, where they were busy building careers. For most of us, the corvettes, the frigates, the bangors, and the old four-stackers and other obsolete destroyers of the escort fleet became home. At the end of the war, some of the fellows I'd stood watch with in the early days were still around. Most of them in different ships, in different jobs, but still accustomed to spending their days slumped against a bridge dodger, with an elbow hooked around a voice pipe while the old bucket rolled their guts out beneath them. The Corvette Navy was more of a way of a life than anything else. It was a way of life a world away from the real Canadian Navy envisioned. Training and accordiness reflected the gap between the two. With dozens of other keen young types, I'd done a course at the Royal Military College Stone Frigate in Kingston. At the time, the only naval officers training establishment available in the country. We were trained there to take our places in the Grand Fleet that had fought at Jutland a generation before. We became proficient after hours on the parade ground at drilling in fours, only to find when he emerged that some brass hat had changed the rules, and everyone had switched over to drilling in threes. We were none of us much good at parade grounds after that, and Gunner's Mate, those spit and polish tyrants, were an especial nightmare. To this day, I can recall with real fright the fearful aspects of a veteran Gunner's Mate whose attention had been drawn to the wavering performance of a platoon led by me during morning divisions on the parade ground at Esquimalt. Divisions is the morning ceremony parade that begins the day in big ships or land bases of the Royal Navy, full of stamping feet and shouted commands and brass bands, and when properly done, is a pretty stirring stuff. With all those gaiters and bayonets and bugles, my lot, a bunch of raw entries straight from Brandon and Swift Current lacked the snap and precision of the Brigade of the Guards, and drawing ourselves upon the center of the gunners pursuing on the days, we were horrified to see the burly form of the most irascible of the old gunners mates descending upon us, black as a thundercloud. In a moment he was in our midst. I can see him now as he ducked down so that he was invisible to the official eyes of the dais. He marched along backwards, bent over his legs, a Melvian Quasimodo, and mouthed at us in some sort of hiss that pierced us to our chicken hearts. It was a fearsome sight. His eyes glared at us from beneath battling brows. His visage was like raw, bloody beef. He was viewed as a shave with an axe, and his features were consorted with a rage that seemed to assume instantly at will. If you effing young bastards don't effing start up, holy Jesus, have your effing guts for me effing garters, he said, making violent pulling motions with his ham-like hands. No words could convey the infinite message of that fearful figure, its red face, pocked and seamed by years of exotic ethics with the China squadron. Thrust in the pale ranks of my pimply schoolboys, having imparted his frightful warning, he vanished from our midst like some pantomime demon. Doubling smartly to one side, he resumed his position on the perimeter of the parade ground, a rigid, uptight figure, staring unseemingly to his front, his thumbs behind the seams of his trousers. God, how we marched ashen-faced and green of gill throughout the remainder of that ghastly rigadoon. Not least of the attractions of the escort navy was that parades of any sort played no part in his daily routine. In Corvettes, we did not parade. We fell in and fell out, and life was immeasurably eased thereafter. It was the same to us, just about everything the big Navy imparted. A dear old stick of Edwardian naval officer gallantly returned to duty after years of retirement, initiated us into the mysteries of celestial navigation using a sextant and a laborious system of sines and cosines that took hours to work out, and with which any of Nelson's officers would have been familiar. We used to be testing our proficiency by being sent out to establish the position of the RMC jetty with a series of star sights, but such toll was involved that many of us, I blush to admit, preferred to work it out backwards. Afterwards, after all, we knew where we were. We simply looked up our latitude and longitude and worked out backwards through the tables to find out what our sextant angle should have been, and with trifling error added to part for similar too precise an observation might arouse suspicion. Our instructor was old and tired, so tired that the circles around the circles he endlessly chalked on the blackboard and all ended in untidy eclipses. He mumbled and muttered rather than spoke, communication being tendered even more difficult by a plummy upper-class accent. Inevitably, he was known to us all as Rumble Guts, and it's widely affirmed that he never spoke. He simply opened his mouth and let his guts rumble. From this point, he would mumble, is his chalk screeching dust we draw the line down to, and dozens of us bent our head over desk would explanate for him the cruel and it's the unconscious cruelty of youth on a day. He was a delightful old party, beloved of all of us, but when we went to sea, we found that the escort navy, navigated by the new Air Force intercept method, an infinitely faster and simpler technique. All Rumble Guts' laborious process had just become a memory along with chalk dust. Even in our warlike exercises, enormously enjoyed at the time, proved to have little practical application in the curious force we are destined to join. Revolver practice had a particular attraction for us in my mind's eye. I pictured myself, Webley in hand, waving my gallant lads on as we swarmed over the decks of some cringing foeman. Alas for reality, in all my years in the small ship navy, the only non-practiced revolver shot I heard was fired in the dark watches of a refit port by a bored sentry who got to fiddling with the revolver in his belt and put a bullet into his foot, thereby after being reduced to carrying an empty weapon with the bullets in his pocket. But gunnery school was the highlight of our training, the very heart and essence of the big Navy. Everything was done with snap and precision. We moved at the double, and the moment we halted anywhere, we would number off, or dress our line, or sort ourselves out according to height. Tallest on the left, shortest on the right, size. My particular daydream grew out of the calm precision and that prevailed in the big ship gunnery communication that we practiced in school. With each gun in a ship's armament reporting to its state, set in ritual phrases, to a central control transmitting station called TS, deep in the armored bowels of a great battleship. Number 1 gun, TS. The rating from number 1 gun would call. TS, number 1 gun. The transmitting station officer would reply. Number 1 gun cleared away. Bore clear. And so, each gun would report in, ready for action as the turrets trained around, and the mighty ship prepared to annihilate some distant foe. Then would come to the thrilling command. All guns with a full charge and armor-piercing shell. Load, load, load. In the clinical calm of the transmitting station of the gunnery school, we would be born in the battle with the chanted orders and response intoned by like some litany. In our daydreams, we saw ourselves at our moment of triumph, or some glorious sacrifice, serene and unruffled in the eye of the storm. The reality of Corvette gunnery was a fearful blow. The gun on our forecastle, a 4-inch turn-of-the-century antique, was a sad come-down after all the gleaming monsters of gunnery school. But it remained for our first gunnery action to completely dispel my dreams of glory. There had been a frightful bang in a convoy in one dark, windy night. As we tumbled up to a crowded bridge, the captain was sucking his teeth and wondering audibly what the hell the holdup was with the bloody star shell. So we were now supposed to be illuminating our sector of water in search of a surface U-boat. Stung into fury, our bearded number 1, who was also gunnery officer, leaned over the canvas dodger and addressed the blackness below, where the rattles and bangs and muffled oaths indicated the gun's crew were clearing for action. Get cracking with that effing gun, he roared, or I'll come down there and boot you in the effing backsides up through your effing teeth. So much for the ordered calm, the chanted litany, and the unruffled position of the gunnery world in the escort navy. Yet for all of that, the big navy taught us much that was of use. Seamanship and signaling, pilotage, and boat work. What a shower of useless clots, our hard-case old petty officer instructor had moaned as he watched us oars astride, attempting to come alongside. You come up crawling like an effing great spider. Most important of all, it taught us pride. Great overweening pride in the Navy, the best, oldest senior service. And in our association with the Royal Navy, the Navy, with its glorious traditions, a victory going back into the mist of time. It was not taught us in class, but was simply acquired by a sort of osmosis. One picked it up unconsciously from the association with instructors steeped in the old Navy. And of all the lessons learned ashore, it stood us greatest stead at sea. There was little enough to be proud of in the early days of the Corvette Navy, whose experience and direction of such a short supply. Everything in the Corvette depended upon the character and competence of the captain. If you were fortunate enough, as I was, to serve in a new ship commanded by an experienced merchant seaman able to adapt to naval routines, you were one of a lucky minority. Most of the new ships in early months were a shambles. Some were downright disgraceful. There was incompetence of every sort, at every level. Some of the ships were barely able to get to sea, and once there, they were fortunate to find their way back to the port without mishap. Discipline was chronic. Drunken captains, useless officers, mutinous crews were commonplace. Those of us in well-run ships grew to dread the prospect of a new Canadian corvettes joining our group and tarnishing our Canadian image in the eyes of thunderstruck friends in the British ships or bases. It was often all too easy to pick out the Canadian from a group of corvettes alongside. She was the dirty one, with rusted sides, half her crew in tattered clothes of every sort, playing catch on the jetty. But with the passage of time and growing experience, we Canadians came of age. The drunks, the cowards, the incompetents wheedled berths ashore, abler officers took command, and abler men qualified as leading seamen and petty officers. Discipline, and with it the contentment of the crew and efficiency of ships, improved tremendously. Once they had acquired the confidence born of experience, the superior education and intelligence of Canadian crews began to make itself felt. In the closing years of the war, Canadian frigates and corvettes were considered to be the best there was, and the maple leaf on that funnel, the unofficial emblem first adopted by Canadian ships abroad, indicated new pride in their nationality. It was in these years that a new relationship developed between Canada's two navies. As the new techniques of anti-submarine warfare evolved, it was the reservists afloat in the corvettes who achieved expertise in mastering their challenge. People like Nelson Earl, Canada's top seagoing anti-sub officer. By the war's end, the best and most highly qualified specialists were reservists to a man. The endless versions of Aztec sonar sets and the development of creeping attacks, of hedgehog and limbo ahead throwing weapons, of high frequency defect correction finding, of VHF communication, of radar and acoustic torpedoes and sonar buoys. All of these familiar features of the escort navy were a closed book to the old line officers of the big navy ashore, save for a handful at sea and destroyers. But not only ships and weapons had changed since the big navy came ashore. Crews had changed too, both in character and in competence. The new discipline of the escort groups was based on a team concept rather than on rank structure, and as in bomber aircraft, officers and men worked in close association, in positions that were often interchangeable. In such a context, the old parade ground discipline was out of place. Officers did not bellow orders to escorts automatons. In the sub-hunt, the directing officer sought information from this rating, passed an instruction to that one, listened to caution and suggestion from another. All were engaged in a common effort to resolve an urgent problem. It was commonplace to hear the officer directing a hunt steady his team of operators and plotters in much the same way a coach might steady his team. All right, fellas, let's steady down and take this baby. Nobody saluted anyone in the Corvette at sea, yet there was unquestioned obedience throughout any well-run ship. It was a discipline based on respect and a hierarchy based on responsibility rather than on social order. The old discipline of the big navy, inherited from the Royal Navy, was based on an officer class whose education, character, and social background were worlds removed from those of the seamen. On the lower deck, SOT was not encouraged. A man did as little as he could get away with, and the whole disciplinary system was geared to produce an acceptable standard performance from an indifferent crew. It was a system measured in outward show. It was a lot of stamping and shouting and saluting. But a new discipline involved in the North Atlantic escort ships. It stemmed from the fact that in many cases, officers and men came from the same levels of society. Often they lived across from each other on the same streets, had attended the same schools. There was still the old need for obedience and deference to authority, responsibility. But it could no longer be based on the class structure of the old-fashioned Navy, earned a system of enforcing Marine guards and regulating officers and the non-commissioned hierarchy of the big ship routine. The new escort ship discipline was effective, if not showy. Officers were still segregated from men, essential to any discipline, but they ate the same food, prepared the same galley, the same wardrobe as on the mess decks. When the big Navy attempted to enforce the old discipline in the old way, as it returned to sea and the big cruisers and carriers at last available at the war's end, it ran into trouble. A dashing pre-war destroyer officer found himself unable to command a tribal-class destroyer when he returned to sea late in the war, and was taken ashore with his crew in a state of mutiny. Trouble persisted after the war, but this time it was the professionals who found themselves learning from the amateurs. For in the end, it was the team-style discipline developed in the escort navy that prevailed in both Britain's Royal Navy and the Royal Canadian Navy, and this acceptance was an indication of the curious reversal of roles between amateur and professional that had taken place during the war years. For the Battle of the Atlantic turned its amateur reservists into the true professionals in anti-submarine warfare, and reduced the shore-bound officers of the big navy to beginners who had to relearn their trade before they were fit to go back to sea. In the North Atlantic, the little ship navy had become number one.